Good afternoon, everyone. Quick disclaimer from the organizers to log on to slido.com on your browser and to enter hashtag South by Southwest and enter your questions, which will be compiled, and we'll get to them as soon as I'm done with my presentation. Or if you prefer actual face-to-face human interaction, you can go right up to the microphones and ask questions. So, with that out of the way, how are we going to fix America and stop screwing up the world in exactly 60 minutes? Look, every society thrives on certain myths, right? Stories that we tell ourselves that glorify the past, explain the present, and give us some sense of security about the future. And of course, here in America, we too have our myths. One of them goes like this. No matter what we do, no matter whom we elect as president, no matter what country we invade, it's fundamentally justified. We're a democracy. We have the rule of law. Power is ultimately vested in the people. And God knows our system is, at the end of the day, better than all the others. So today, I don't want to indulge in too much myth busting. I don't want to be negative. What I want to do is be analytical and constructive, because America is a land that has great responsibilities to its own people and to the world. And I think that we can certainly make our government better and do a better job at meeting all of those responsibilities. That's what I'm going to talk about today. It starts really by overcoming some of the fundamental misunderstandings that we have about what ails us. And I like to take a bit of a geographic approach. And by that, I don't just mean red state versus blue state, because I think we've all realized it's a bit more complicated than that. One of the key issues when it comes to geography is actually looking at the urbanization rate. America is the least urbanized of advanced modern Western industrial democracies, the fewest number of people living in dense urban areas. And that, as we've seen around the world, including in the US in the last several election cycles, actually is a very strong correlating factor to election outcomes. More dense areas, dense cities tend to be more liberal. More sparse, more rural areas tend to be more conservative. So you can have a red state like Texas, but have blue cities like Austin or Dallas. And we've seen that around the country. So the urbanization rate is an extremely important factor in understanding why America feels so divided today. Another is how sedentary we are. There are many countries in the world where when there's an economic crisis, when jobs are lost because of falling trade or whatever the case may be, people just get up and move. They go to where they have to go. Even in a country like China, where they have something called the hukou system, which even restricts migration, people literally find ways to just move to a new city, start a new life very, very quickly, and then maybe come back and circulate. We tend to be a little bit more sedentary. There is some migration, as you can see here, occurring from east to west in the US, but the rate is not really that significant. So people are quite wedded or clinging to some of the, say, Rust Belt areas where things may never really return to the glory days. That gets to this issue of infrastructure. Our infrastructure sucks, as everyone knows. It's particularly, well, it's nationwide, but it hits hardest in some of the areas like the Rust Belt, areas that are strong manufacturing centers where you would want to see a lot more efficiency of the manufacturing sector and the ability to move goods around, not only around within the country, but certainly to export them. So that also is a critical factor in inequality. Inequality is not just about money. It's not just about what one person's disposable income is or versus another. It's also about your access to dynamic commercial centers such as cities. When people don't have access to whether it's broadband internet or whether it's to a fast, to a railway or a highway to get to places where they can earn more money, sell more goods, and so forth, that is a form of inequality. It costs them more to live a basic normal life. And so bad infrastructure means disconnected people, means perpetual, persistent inequality. Now, another part of the inequality problem is also in the West, because now as people are migrating to the south, to Texas, also to the western states, the states that are colored dark blue here, not only is the infrastructure inadequate, but it also relates to our environmental infrastructure. Because right now in the south and the west, we have droughts. We have falling water tables. Lake Mead, if you've ever flown into Las Vegas and you've seen, is the water level is dropping very, very low. So we have a sustainability issue as well, and we're not building adequately to cope with that. And then on top of all of that is the stuff that we really usually talk about when we talk about the divides, which is really about the way the federal government, well, in a federal system of government, the way the center, the capital relates to the states. And that is fundamentally about the devolution in our system. States have power, of course. States can fight back, and that's what we're seeing right now. It happens generally in two ways. There's the fiscal way, in which states say, we're not really getting sufficient returns on all the tax money that we pay in. So some states will raise their state taxes and say, we want to retain as much money as we can and invest it in ourselves. That's what's starting to happen in places like California, even in Washington state. And then there's the legal approach to fighting, to infighting, if you will, with Washington, and that we're seeing happening all the time. It's California saying that they don't like the wall, and they're going to use various environmental protection powers that are reserved to states to fight against it, or it's sanctuary cities saying, we don't want the FBI or the ICE or whatever coming in and arresting people. We need immigrants in these cities, in these places. So there's this legal civil war, if you will, that's sort of brewing. So if you add all of that up, that helps to explain to some extent why we have such a loss of faith in politicians. And it's much worse than that, because it's actually a loss of faith in our institutions. It's a much deeper level of anxiety, a deeper, more existential problem, quite frankly. So trust in government in the United States has been declining very, very substantially in just the past few decades, 75% down to 20% today. And it gets worse and worse the younger and younger people are. What you can see here in this chart from the New York Times is that it moves from left to right, older to younger. So as you go to the right, the age of the people surveyed in countries of Western societies, the United States is fourth over from the left, is absolutely plummeting. So that's the percentage of people who say that it's essential to live in a democratic society. Now, what's also happening, there's many surveys that cut at different aspects of this question of lack of trust in government. Another is the political forces themselves. It's quite a remarkable feat to have people on the left and people on the right saying that the system is rigged. I mean, one of them has to be rigging it, and so you really must have a rigged system if both sides are saying that it's rigged. Quite an accomplishment. And so what are people then more in favor of? We don't really know for sure, but what we have seen is that when people are asked whether politicians should just get out of the way and let experts decide what's best, that percentage of people is going up. But we don't know enough what that really means to have experts call more of the shots in this country. It's a big subject of debate right now, and it's what I'm going to go into a little bit more. Suffice it to say that just having a system of checks and balances, having the structure of government, the democratic form of government that we do have, is not sufficient to actually deliver the kind of measurable progress that we want to see that would make people respond very differently in terms of being satisfied in their government. So what kind of system would be better? I want to offer some tentative answers. It's been about 25 years since Francis Fukuyama wrote his landmark book, The End of History, in which, just to caricature the argument, Western liberal democracy, especially given the triumph of the West and the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War, is really the last form of government that we can imagine. It's the kind of government that every society either aspires to or will necessarily gravitate towards, with America really being the highest embodiment of that. We've come a long way in 25 years in terms of our thinking about how we need to move beyond just praising democracy and sort of thriving in our democracy just for the sake of it versus what constitutes good governance. And to that end, I've written this new book, Technocracy in America. Technocracy refers to a system of government in which there is a much stronger role for expertise, for experts. Some would call them technocrats. But technocrat and expert are not synonyms. Otherwise, I wouldn't use the word technocrat, right? There's a certain kind of qualification that someone has to be considered a technocratic leader, shaping policy decisions for an entire country, taking on that enormous responsibility and augmenting the role that our democratic institutions play. In other words, voters and the voice of the electorate. So let me go through some of the key issues here that I think we've learned in the last quarter century as, again, our own public support for our own democracy, for our own institutions, appears to be in decline. What can we learn from other ways of approaching the issue of how to govern the country better? Well, people who celebrate who hearken back to America as a great democracy, cite some of the great philosophers of the Western Enlightenment tradition, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, those philosophers who argue that fundamentally human liberty, the voice of the people, the pure, unadulterated democratic process is the greatest guarantor of liberty and the most important foundation and form of government that we need to have. Those who focus more on how do you structure a government to, again, to be this sort of protector of welfare and to deliver progress, look more at the work of Plato, ancient Greek philosopher, and Max Weber from the late 19th century. What they argued, particularly Plato, for those who have read The Republic, refers to the guardians, right? An aristocratic class, as it was back then, though it doesn't have to be today, of experts, of knowledgeable noblemen who were able to make far-sighted decisions on behalf of society. The lesson is that democracy alone is, again, insufficient to make the strategic long-term decisions. We have a lot of volatility, if you will, in our process, and that kind of expertise matters, especially today, I believe, in a world that's very, very complex, where there's domestic issues, international issues, and feedback loops between them. I think it's important that we balance pure democracy and the role of expertise. The Founding Fathers did not disagree with this at all. If you go back to what some of them wrote, whether you're looking at the Federalist Papers or other writings, the Founding Fathers actually had were to some degree afraid of democracy, pure democracy. They would, and I think you've probably been reading a lot about this in the press, would look at today's landscape and see some of their worst fears coming true. They used phrases like democracy is mob rule. Pure democracy is a recipe for societies to inevitably commit suicide and to descend into tyranny. They read Plato as much as they did Rousseau, and they wanted to craft a system that was, in fact, a balance between the two. And so, in fact, we have this Republican form of government with enormous power vested in the executive. There is, of course, a very important role for liberty, for freedom, for individual voice, but democracy does, in fact, have to be tempered through certain institutions. The lesson being that, yes, power is vested in the people, but we have to be very, very careful about how we select our leaders to represent the people. And it's not just about their democratic virtues that they were elected. There has to be something more there if they're going to be the guardians of our national welfare. Which gets us to this question of what kind of leaders do we have? Are they just self-serving elected politicians and their acolytes, friends of whomever? Or could there be some role for independent professionals, people who are trained vocationally in various aspects of governance, right? Whether it is our infrastructure, whether it's foreign policy, rather than just simply throwing people out every 4 years. We see that, only in America do you have 4,000 federal appointments that have to be made every time a new president comes in. So the whole top level of government across so many agencies is just constantly cycled in and out. In a more technocratic system, you wouldn't have that happen. There would be professionals who get to retain their role because they know what they know and they're loyal to the country, not just to one party or one president and so forth. That system does, in fact, exist in many, many places, but much less so here. What's the lesson? Well, to be more specific about what I mean by the qualifications of a technocrat, what is the difference between just an expert who's a friend of the president and someone who is a genuinely impartial, competent professional? I believe that there are two key virtues or features of a technocratic system. One is meritocracy, right? Meritocracy is about the demonstrated, the proven, the tested or verified skill set that a person has, whether it's their education, whether it's their experience that they've had at a municipal level, at a state level, or in other bureaucracies before they get handed the keys for an entire government, right? What is their degree of training for the job? So in a technocratic system, you really wouldn't have Ben Carson running HUD, or Betsy DeVos running education, or Rick Perry running energy, right? To name just a few. They would actually have a lot of experience in the areas that they've been tasked with governing the world's wealthiest, most powerful, most complex society in the history of the world. They would actually be prepared for the job, God forbid. Second key principle, utilitarianism. This is extraordinarily important. Utilitarianism is roughly the greatest good for the greatest number, right? The idea that you're seeking to maximize the welfare of everyone, or the largest number of people that you can in society. Obviously, this is extremely important when you think about how divided we are, how much inequality we have, how many studies have shown that voter preferences are not reflected in what Congress actually does, right? You can have surveys, and you can have state by state canvassing of the population about what their views are on certain issues. Congress never seems to actually do what the voter preferences are, and there's a lot of research to back this up. In a utilitarian system, that wouldn't so much be the case. So you'd have if you were to balance democracy and technocracy, you would at least hopefully have more leaders that subscribe to these two principles. Now, there's other very significant differences here. When you think about democracy as being the most legitimate form of government, you're basically saying that the only thing that matters, the only thing that makes the system virtuous, or that's necessary to make the system the best system, is that it has input legitimacy. In other words, it is a democratic process, and everyone's gotten a vote, and whatever the outcome is, whoever gets elected, that system is right. When you think more in the frame of, well, what constitutes a well-governed society, you would want to see outputs as well. You'd want to say, let's measure whether or not this government actually did anything. And that, too, really matters for its legitimacy. This is why people, when they talk about China, they say, of course, it doesn't have a whole lot of input legitimacy. There's no democratic elections in China, right? But it has output legitimacy because it's clearly done a lot of good things for its people. It's raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in just the last couple of decades, and so on and so on. One is not better than the other, but clearly it would be nice to have a system where we think about our legitimacy as not just being a feature of democratic input, but also output, delivery. And you can actually measure that. And that's what happens so often in countries that do this well. They don't, to look at when they use, for example, when you look at the role of technology and social media, obviously a very hot topic here at this event. If you look back at the last couple of election cycles where social media has played an ever more prominent role, you hear about it largely from the perspective of the geolocated, district-level, census-driven ground game that either Obama had or Trump used to really target voter sentiments based on what their jobs are and what their income is. So technology is all about how can I use this to gain votes, to manipulate voters, to target messaging, and so forth. Well, there's another way, obviously, to use technology, especially when you have Western societies where voter turnout is not very high. How do you actually know what people want if they're not voting? And not only that, what about all the time in between elections? How can you use big data better to understand what people's needs are, right? And also, obviously, all the people who are too old to vote or too young to vote, and so on and so forth. We should be using data in much more sophisticated, much more robust ways to actually understand the needs of the people. And you can use that data, again, not just to target them for elections, but to help to pinpoint public services, for example. Again, this happens all over the world all the time. In our situation here, we are always talking about social media more from the political standpoint rather than from the policy standpoint, and that worries me a lot. And so when I was talking about this issue of measurement, right? How do we measure that performance? Right now, we are just measuring what's happening in our political system by the flip-flops, right? From one party to the next. We're in the midst of a populist upheaval right now. And what's missing from that is are we improving, right? Is quality of life getting better? Are we measuring the results of our policies? And that's what is meant by KPI, Key Performance Indicator. This is a term that obviously management consultants like to use, but governments do it as well because they want to know whether or not they're actually doing a good job or not doing a good job. That means if we've made certain investments in healthcare, if we've made investments in infrastructure, made investments in education policy, what is the actual result? So often in this country, we start policies for a year or two, then we repeal them, then we go way off in the opposite direction, then we stop that and we go back again. That is not exactly going to yield steady progress on key fundamental issues. And so I think that what we can learn, again, is that there has to be a collective focus on certain fundamental goals that we have to agree on. And if you look at countries like, say, in Western Europe, we criticize from this side of the Atlantic, we criticize these bloated welfare states and high taxes. But there's been a lot of research that shows that if you take how much even a French person, even as they raise taxes, okay, fine, maybe it no longer applies to France because they've raised taxes a lot. But many European countries, if you add up what an average person spends after tax on just all of their health, education, all these basics, what we spend with lower taxes, but have to add on for all of the private services that people spend on this country, it winds up being about the same, if not more. So there's certain non-negotiable things in countries in Western Europe where there's universal health care, right? And there's very good high-quality infrastructure, and education is free. Once you decide on those fundamentals, there's certain things that you shouldn't be flip-flopping on all the time. That's actually wastes a lot of time and a lot of money, and it certainly doesn't benefit the population. So in conclusion on this point, it's not surprising given what's happening in this country, what we're seeing in other countries where, again, democracy is not delivering. There's more and more surveys like Freedom House and others that are saying that democracy is actually backsliding in many places. People are getting totally fed up with their leadership, with their system of government, but they don't necessarily know what's next. My view is that we have to, or that we can improve, not only in America, but in many other places, if we combine our democratic virtues with a bit more rational, technocratic kinds of thinking and learning. So let me apply it to the US government. This is my org chart from the Technocracy book. And what I try to do is to blend the virtues of the so-called direct democracy system, which when we use that term, we tend to think of the country of Switzerland, right? Where there's plebiscites for everything and there's referenda and initiatives every single week. It's kind of where California's practices come from, but they do it a lot better in Switzerland. It's a much smaller country, obviously. But one of the things that's interesting about the Swiss government is that they have a federal executive council. They have 7 presidents, not just 1. And the interesting thing about having 7 presidents is that every day you get 7 people together who are actually elected. Each of them is an elected leader, representing actually out of those 7 people 4 different parties. So you have like a team of rivals effect, right? Team of rivals is not just what it means here, where it's, I'll just take some token person from across the aisle and I'll include them in the cabinet, but I won't really listen to them. They, every single day, are a team of rivals. It's 7 people from 4 different parties who are arguing, who are negotiating, but are compromising on major strategic issues. And that happens every single day. And Switzerland, being the oldest continuous democracy, 700-800 years, they've been doing a pretty good job at it, right? And I think we could learn from that. I think that rather than have a cabinet where, again, everyone is just plucked from the outside, irrespective of their qualifications, instead, we could actually have something of an executive committee where instead of one guy sitting behind a desk making all the decisions, having to understand, again, domestic policy, international policy, and juggle 25 balls in the air, you actually could have something of a committee-like structure where you share knowledge. 7 heads are better than 1. It could be 7, it could be 10. Our cabinet actually is getting larger and larger in terms of the number of portfolios, and I think there's a lot of overlap and inefficiency and waste in that as well. So what I've done is actually, it's probably too small to read on the bottom, but it's in the book. I sort of merged together different cabinet agencies. When I was researching this, I thought I had some original ideas about Department of Commerce and Department of Labor would make sense if they were together, and and various other configurations, rather than everything just multiplying and getting bigger and bigger, like creating the Department of Homeland Security on top of everything else. And so for every idea that I had that I thought was original, I just Googled it. And lo and behold, just about every single thing that I put in here has already been proposed by none other than the Congressional Research Service. Our own government, the experts, the underpaid professionals in the Congressional Research Service and other organs of the government have already done all this research and made these proposals going back 20, 25 years. But of course, why would our politicians listen to them, right? When there's influence to be peddled, gains to be had by expanding more bureaucracies, more positions, and allocating more posts to friends. Again, that may be good for certain interests and for certain people, but it's not necessarily good for efficiently delivering public services to us, Americans. There are a lot of other things that we could do to actually reform the structure of government to, again, balance democracy and technocracy. One is to have a stronger civil service. One of Trump's first executive orders was to freeze federal workforce hiring. It was either his first or his second executive order. It was obviously extremely important to him. And it goes very much in the opposite direction of what you see governments do, that are, again, really trying to rationally measure and calculate and study what are the best policies for healthcare or infrastructure around the world, and how can we adopt them. How can you do that if there isn't anyone whose job it is to do that? And again, in many other countries, take Germany, take Switzerland, take Singapore, China, all over the world, the United Kingdom, Canada, they all have stronger civil services. We have been gutting and weakening and firing and humiliating, effectively, our federal workforce, our loyal civil servants for decades now. It's been happening since Nixon. Newt Gingrich in the 1990s made it his priority to also freeze federal worker hiring, to shrink the federal workforce as well. And anyone who's worked particularly in Washington knows that there have been all of these furloughs and, days, the mandatory days off from work and all of these kinds of things. That doesn't really inspire people to want, talented people to want to join the government and work for the government. And of course, it drives them away. That's the exact opposite of what we should be doing when you need experts to actually keep track of all of the major issues and changes that are going on in the world. One of the other proposals I have is to abolish the Senate. Did I just say that? Oops, just by the way, I think we should abolish the Senate. And there's actually a very good reason for that. And again, I thought this would be a novel idea, but in fact, as it turns out, that the Senate was, of course, designed to be a check on the House of Representatives, a sort of, more far-sighted body of selected experts. The direct elections for the Senate only were initiated with, I'm going to forget the amendment number, maybe it was the 18th Amendment. Someone correct me right now. Well, come on, you guys, one of you should know this. I think it was around the 18th Amendment. So it was meant to be sort of detached, if you will, from the sort of reckless whims of the people, which were really embodied in the House of Representatives. But and most senators, this is the most interesting thing, most senators of the 100 senators used to actually be former governors. And governors have run states. They know how to administer a sort of political unit, right? They know how to manage a budget. They know how to do the kinds of wheeling and dealing, but they've actually run large bureaucracies. Governors have done that, and most senators used to be former governors, and so it was their chance to step up and move to Washington and use that experience to guide policy. Today, most senators are former reps, right? So that means they've gone from being one kind of representative with probably no administrative experience running anything to just a more elevated or more elite form of representative who's never run anything, right? So what you have now is two houses of representatives, one with 435 people and one with 100 people. I don't see the point. I don't see the point in that. I have a lot of faith in governors, and so do the American people. Survey after survey suggests that governors and mayors are by far the most respected political figures and most trusted political figures in our country because they've actually run things. They've actually, again, administered large bureaucracies and budgets. And the governors, the National Governors Assembly, or National Governors Association, is a place where governors get together and all actually talk about the kinds of things that they need to do together, the kinds of cross-border initiatives, the kinds of regional policies that would benefit large parts of the country, whereas in the Senate and the House of Representatives, we find that they're just all consumed with just procedural motions and, blocking the president, or just, very sort of political kinds of exercises, or lobbying for pork barrel spending, whatever the case may be, but certainly not the focus on improving lives the way we see that governors so often are good at doing. So that's another proposal. And I go into a lot more detail on this, but suffice it to say that we can. It's not so deeply entrenched, in the Constitution that we can't gradually find ways to revise the ways in which we structure the government so that it can, again, better cope with a complex world, so that it can take into account a sort of stronger role for expertise, and so that we can have more continuity in national policy rather than flip-flopping all the time. I'm going to talk more about some of the specifics as we go through this. One of the fundamental things, you might have noticed that in the middle of the org chart, one of the cabinet positions I created was the Department of Infrastructure. I think that's very, very fundamental. Again, it's something that we all agree upon. During the election campaign, I think there was only one thing that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton agreed on, and that was the sorry state of our infrastructure. So one of the things I've been trying to do is to map out what are the ways in which you could literally knit America together again physically. We have such ridiculous inefficiencies in our transportation infrastructure, and it creates, again, a lot of structural inequality. Whether it's people stuck in traffic for much longer than they should be, or whether it's the slow movement of a freight rail, of energy, of even food around the country. Having bad infrastructure wastes a lot of money and is actually a big drag on growth. So what I've put on here are some of the rail networks, whether it's high-speed rail, or Amtrak Plus, I guess is the best we'd ever wind up doing here. That have been proposed. They go back to even before the Obama administration, but certainly Obama backed having these. But here we are 8 years later, and we still don't have a single kilometer of high-speed rail. And yet, you can clearly identify what the most significant demographic clusters are in the U.S. About 40 major metropolitan regions. That's these sort of white zones, or those within the white zones. And then the colored swaths are the kind of economic regions of the United States. There is no doubt that if we had more of this physical connectivity across the country, the U.S. would feel more like a whole greater than the sum of its parts, rather than a country that we can constantly feel is divided and is less than the sum of its parts. And so infrastructure is absolutely critical. Dartmouth University, some scholars there did a very interesting study looking at people's commuter patterns and their spending patterns, and they produced this map on the right that shows you where those really 40 core economic regions are. Again, that's where most of the people are, that's where most of the economic activity is, and that's where every single one of these 40 areas has major infrastructural gaps and bottlenecks. So if you take sort of, again, technocratic approach here, if you look at studying what other countries have done, what our own past tells us in terms of good policy, what scholarly analysis says about what certain continuous and long-term policy areas and investments should be, here are some of the things that you would come up with. And I want to emphasize, these are not my pet policy issues, because that list may be a lot longer, right? This is what reams of analysis, decades of research across left and right, have generally told us are sort of better policies for us to pursue, and that would mean that whoever is elected any given time, you're working within this point of view rather than the kind of fighting between the kind of extremes the way we are now. We know, for example, that when it comes to immigration, you look at the demographic structure of a society. How many aging people do you have? How many young people do you have? What sectors do they work in? And you have to constantly replenish if you don't have a high enough fertility rate, and if people aren't being educated in certain areas, you need to import people for those sectors. It's not the fault of the Indian government or Indian society that they take up a large share of the H-1B visa quota every year. We have a shortage in the number of people qualified for the number of tech jobs that are available in the country. That's just a fact, right? So immigration policy should be a lot more nuanced. There's a joke I saw this morning in some website that said, Trump keeps on talking about how we should have a more Canadian-style immigration policy. Well, if you did, that would mean a lot more immigrants rather than a lot less. So ironies abound in every one of these areas. But suffice it to say that we don't have to have this all-or-nothing immigration conversation. It could be a lot more tailored and nuanced, and it's embarrassing that it hasn't gotten to that level. As I said, urbanization. Especially because of, again, our low urbanization rate, we have to get more dynamic activity going in the services sector of our urban areas. And that also requires not only immigrants, but also retraining of the workforce, getting people to move around to the areas where they can be most productive. Infrastructure and healthcare, as I said before in the European example, not everything should be negotiated every couple of years. We half build roads. Right? Other places don't do that. It's not smart. There's no justification for it. Being a democracy does not excuse the fact that you're wasting money on half-built roads. There is no excuse for it. Our energy revolution, are we taking sufficient advantage of it? We're flip-flopping a lot on things like XL pipeline or Dakota pipeline, these kinds of things, whether or not to export energy, not to export energy. There's a lot of research that has gone into how you would take advantage of the shale gas revolution that we have right now. And I think we could learn a lot of lessons from that. I want to talk about some of the political things. We have a two-party system. Nowhere does the word party appear in the American Constitution, right? But we have this self-formed, ossified duopoly in our political system. But every country in the world that ranks higher than the United States, according to the Economist's Quality of Democracy Index, there are about 19 countries that rank higher than us. What all 19 of them have in common is that they're multi-party parliamentary systems. In a multi-party system, you have a much more genuine representation of people's interests. You actually have to constantly negotiate. You can't just agree to stonewall on a certain issue, but that's okay because at least both parties remain in power and there's no party challenging them. In a multi-party system, 3, 4, 5, 10 parties, you have a constant need to deliver on your promises, on your agenda. Otherwise, a snap election will be called and you'll be thrown out very, very quickly. Now, that can be taken to an extreme. In a country like Australia, you seem to have a new prime minister every year. We don't necessarily want that. But in a multi-party system, you certainly have a lot more sense that if the government, if the parliament is not rapidly accountable to citizen demands, they're going to get tossed out a lot faster than happens here. So I think that's very important. I've already talked about the importance of the civil service. We have to move from this balance where everyone who's a politician is just a representative, and yet it's not quite clear what they're representing, versus people who are actually knowledgeable in how to administer the organs of government and how to actually make bureaucracies move and deliver. There's a few other things here. Our policies around taxation and around corporate governance and so forth aren't right now, especially since the financial crisis, necessarily incentivizing our banks and our lenders to actually provide the capital that we know that small businesses need. The Obama administration created a small business administrative sort of unit to help to support small businesses in America, but at the same time, our financial regulation was required that banks hold a lot more capital, and they were choosing not to lend, and they were doing lots of things like share buybacks and so forth. So we were working at cross purposes. But we know, again, it's very plain to see, small businesses need more access to capital. Why haven't we done that yet? And on it goes in terms of, focusing more, reforming our educational system. In lots of countries, you get the educational system, key industrial players, government support for research and development in the same room. And you say, what are the key technologies coming down the pipeline? How do we train our workforce accordingly? What can this, that, and the other institution do to support that? What companies will set up vocational or trainee or apprenticeship programs to hire those people? And you get all the ducks in a row. Here it happens anecdotally, accidentally, haphazardly, desperately, because companies say, we just have such a shortfall in trained workers for what we need, so we're just going to set up our own academies. Now that's fine. That's part of the greatness of American entrepreneurial dynamism. But it's not exactly optimal for a country of 300 million people that we don't strategically think about these things, that success is like an accident, right? It doesn't have to be that way. Now, one of the things that bothered me most about the election is that, in pandering to the very specific Rust Belt districts and swing states, it made it seem like all 300 million of us are factory workers in Detroit, right? Even though there's a declining number of people employed in the manufacturing sector. And millennials, I mean, they came out for all the rallies. They didn't come out on election day, evidently, but came to all of the protests and rallies and so forth. And yet millennial interests, actual interest, the actual policies that would improve the access to economic opportunity that millennials need weren't really talked about, right? Because it was all about sort of Detroit, if you will, and Pennsylvania. But if you really look around and this is truly a global analysis, millennials around the world are facing very similar challenges everywhere, and I didn't see them, and I didn't see their needs reflected in this conversation. I certainly hope that by 2020, not only will more millennials turn out to vote, maybe they learn their lesson, but hopefully we're going to develop the kinds of policies that would support their needs. So, especially because we're moving into an economic structure where full employment is obviously not guaranteed for life. It's not even guaranteed for life anymore in a place like Japan. It's certainly not in America. So everyone's in the gigonomy, effectively. And it's also a sharing economy, right? We move from this sort of, vertical, hierarchical kind of corporate structure to things that are more networked. Things like pensions, right? Just your basic, minimum income that you need to maintain a decent quality of life, or those institutions of pensions and Social Security all need to be reformed and revised. That conversation didn't really take place. Again, even when you heard terms like Social Security in the election, you didn't hear specifics about how it's going to be restructured. In other countries, they're already doing this. They're already talking about wage insurance, wage ladders, depending on the sector. They're talking about shifting who funds worker insurance between companies and governments in countries like Holland and elsewhere. They're years and years and years ahead of us on these issues, because they also have young people, and we should be learning from them. Everything around ownership, whether it's home ownership, car ownership, consumption in general, is changing, and we're not seeing our policies shift to cater to that. One of the most important issues of all is affordable housing, and this is truly global. There's not a country in the world that truly has adequate, affordable housing for its young people. I think you would safely say this is the single most important policy issue around the world in every single country. And it's not unsolvable just because it's universal. If anything, it's very, very straightforward. But of course, in our government, in our society, and in many other places, regulations seem to, in a sort of very free market kind of way, or maybe in a rigged way, favor those interests that are building, that are pushing gentrification, that are making housing costs astronomical in central business districts, but without the connectivity, without the quality infrastructure to allow people who have been moved out into further and further areas to commute much more readily. And you can see this in San Francisco. You can see this just about everywhere. So it is so important that, recently I read a story about what's happening in Canada, where they're saying they're just going to take people who are low income, homeless people, just anyone, and give them a place to live. And a lot of evidence from other countries, too, shows that just by having affordable housing, you unlock your human capacity, not to mention more of your disposable income, to invest in your education, to stay healthy, to go out and look for a job, and so on and so forth. So if you want to have a positive cycle, if you will, for the millennial generation, that's extremely critical, and we haven't been doing it. Some cities have. So you can look at what are the cities that are doing the most to promote higher quality employment, to have sort of nano degrees so that people can get upskilled really quickly in tech and other areas. And Austin is one of them for sure. Portland, you know about, and so on and so forth. And I think that, again, there's already tons of research and experiments around the world, but we're not devoting the resources to learning and to executing. And that's what a country would do if it were to better balance democracy and technocracy. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to couple of foreign policy areas, because right now we are alienating two neighbors that basically any other country in the world would love to have. You know, it's again sort of an embarrassment. Now, the irony is, if you were to listen to our election of the last couple of years, you would think that there already was a big wall on the Mexican border, and that we don't have any immigration or any cross-border movement with Canada. But you certainly would not have heard the simple fact that our two borders are the two busiest borders on the planet Earth. Every day, 365 days a year, you have 50 million crossings between the US and Canada every year. You have 35 million crossings between the US and Mexico. You would think it were zero if you were listening to our election over the last couple of years. And of course, it's very, very advantageous. We actually have, even as Trump, tweets nasty things about Mexico and wants to renegotiate NAFTA, our trade with Mexico is not or with Canada is not particularly imbalanced compared to what it is with other countries. So here we are picking on our two best friends in the world. It makes no sense. If we were to jointly be investing in energy infrastructure, transportation, all of the things that the private sector knows it needs to do, American companies know that by selling in Canada and Mexico is a very important part of their top line, we would actually be creating a lot of jobs in our own economy as well. So we should be liberalizing our relations with Mexico and Canada, not alienating them, which is what we're doing right now. And also, of course, we are three large energy-producing countries that actually sell and could much more efficiently sell and export oil and gas to the rest of the world. We're starting to sell oil to China, but our pipelines actually go down to the Gulf of Mexico, not far from here, and through the Panama Canal and across the Pacific Ocean, rather than being built to the Pacific Ocean, which is what Canada is starting to do. So we should be cooperating a lot more in energy than we do, and on climate change. Let me make a couple more points about our economic policy. It's all well and good in an election to blame China for loss of jobs and outsourcing and so forth. But we've, over the last 25, 30 years, known that jobs in high wage areas and in low skilled areas like manufacturing have been moving to Asia. But other countries have actually been training their workers to move into new higher value added areas with higher wages. We haven't. And that's a very, very, very strong driver of obviously the dissatisfaction in the voting base and the election of Trump. But blaming foreigners just because it sounds good doesn't mean it's true, right? A lot more jobs, as you probably know, are lost to higher productivity and to labor automation than to outsourcing. So here we have, a contrast between the anti-globalization protests of the 1990s and the Occupy Wall Street protests of today. And a lot of that inequality gap obviously has to do with the lack of wage growth amongst America's middle and lower middle classes, but it really is not China's fault. It's our fault. And you can go back to the last 12, 16 years of elections where presidential candidates have been talking about the need for federal worker retraining programs, but not actually doing them. And that's our fault, because other countries have done it, and therefore they don't have as much populism as we have. They don't have the mismatch in the labor force that we have. We have to start blaming ourselves a lot more for the things that we've gotten wrong, because we didn't have to. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, maybe even just towards the end, so we can get to the Q&A. To me, what's happened so far is not necessarily a recipe for disaster or for a crisis. You know, as it turns out, we tend to put ourselves at the center of the world. We think that all geopolitical relations revolve around us. But as it turns out, the world is actually looking at what we're doing with a kind of a mix of shock and horror and taking steps to avoid us. And because the world is getting much more connected, every region of the world now has direct trade relations with every other region of the world. I didn't want to dwell on this too much, but this is a slide that shows you 2/3 of the world's population lives on this two-dimensional slide here. This is the sort of eastern half of the Eurasian landmass. And right now, they are building all of these trade corridors to each other. Europe now trades more with Asia, meaning with China, with Japan, with India, Southeast Asia, Australia, than it does with the United States. So our closest allies are now turning around and saying, Trump's going to be protectionist. We're going to start trading a lot more with Asia. Their economies are growing faster, and that's where 2/3 of the world's population is. So the world is finding lots and lots of ways to make sure that whatever Trump does with trade policy, whatever we do to shoot ourselves in the foot, whatever arrogance and volatility we introduce into the world system, they make sure that they're insulated. They're hedging against us by connecting more with each other. That, in a way, is a good thing. It keeps the world stable. It means that the future course of geopolitics and of history doesn't depend only on who occupies the White House or what our foreign policy is, especially if it's not good policy. But we still have to remain connected to that world. We benefit massively. We misunderstand the benefits of globalization for ourselves because everything has to be boiled down to lies and to sound bites. And instead, we don't realize that by being connected to the rest of the world, it's one of the greatest sources of America's strength. And I boil it down to a few things. One is, as I mentioned before, energy. Right? We are now the world's largest oil and gas producing country. We export to China, we export to Europe. We may want the world to become solar powered and renewable tomorrow, but it's not going to. And so long as there is demand for energy, we should be a provider of it because that actually keeps energy markets stable. And in doing so, there's much less likelihood of war over oil. We can be a key driver of a peaceful world by remaining connected to the world through our energy markets. Another is, of course, finance. You know, the US dollar is still the world's leading reserve currency. And by having a policy that's transparent, clear, and even done in consultation with the rest of the world and thinking through the consequences of rising interest rates and so forth, we could actually maintain a lot more influence that way. Then, of course, there's security. We don't have to police the whole world, but if you look at the real structure that I've mapped out here, where every region is increasingly integrated with each other, we should be supporting regional peacekeeping organizations, regional security alliances, help encourage other areas of the world to police themselves so that we don't have to. Instead, our conversation is always this sort of all or nothing. We have to be there, we have to stabilize, we have to project force. That's a recipe for getting sucked into far-off conflicts that we can no longer afford. But there are other ways of approaching our diplomacy, and we're not doing them. And finally, of course, there is the technology, right? So many of the great digital and even so all of the great connectivity technologies and social media and so forth come from this country, and the rest of the world does want them. They just don't want the NSA backdoors and so forth. So if we can be more transparent in how our technology is governed, we are going to remain very influential because we are still a lot of the innovative sort of ingenuity and so forth comes out of the U.S. So remaining connected is extremely, extremely important, but it's a two-way street. It's not just how do we project onto others, it's also how we can learn from them. So I've sort of made these arguments not because I want us to, and I haven't tried to, overly praise other societies and compare ourselves to them. Constantly comparing oneself to others is a recipe for madness. What you really want to be doing is taking time to study and to learn and to improve. And that is how we'll maintain our edge in the world and hopefully make America great again. Thanks very much. So, it's pretty clear which questions are getting upvoted here, but feel free to line up at the mic as well. I give preference to humans today. But in the meantime, well, let's take you first since you were quick.
So I guess my question would be, you know, obviously lots of very well thought out, you know, sort of diagnoses and and not a lot of obvious green shoots, of major change happening. I'm wondering from your perspective, not that, laying out everything hasn't have incredible value, but when you look at whether it's the multi-party thing you talked about or other areas, where do you see in the next 3 to 5 years, where are you most hopeful that maybe some of these ideas might start to get some traction?
It's a great one. That's also what the first highest upvoted question was. So I would say infrastructure is very important. And again, it's what all sides agree upon. I think that we will get more capital flowing into infrastructure, whether it's going to be, obviously, there's a big dispute between Paul Ryan and Trump about how much the Congress should actually allocate. Whatever they do wind up allocating is going to be a lot less than what the Army Corps of Engineers says we need. At most, the government will probably wind up putting up a quarter of that figure, maybe a couple of $100 billion versus $2.5 trillion. But that said, there'll be momentum. There's a lot of foreign financing that's coming in. The U.S. is by far the largest recipient of foreign investment in the world, about $500 billion. Actually, it looks like because of rising interest rates, stronger dollar, some momentum in the economy, foreign investment in the United States could easily get to $700 or $800 billion a year, and a lot of that would gladly go into infrastructure if it were structured in such a way that there was a decent yield, or return on it. So I think that we will start to get more rebuilding. But again, in other countries, you would have the Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce work together on national kinds of schemes so that you would really spread these benefits evenly. That's not what happens right now. Right now, every state has to make their own transportation kind of, sort of plan. But that's like having, 50 separate kinds of infrastructures. If you think about the last 200 years, if you think about the Pacific Railroads or the Erie Canal or the Tennessee Valley Authority, the interstate highway system, these were all regional, continental scale systems. We thought in an integrated way about a master plan for the country. So even if the money is there, I fear that we are not getting the planning right. But I do think that's really a critical one. I'm not as optimistic in areas like education and healthcare. You can open up the newspaper and see just how badly the healthcare reform debate is going. But let's at least hope we get the infrastructure right. It's so much more important than anyone realizes. You only appreciate it when it's gone. Let me take a question from the, let's see. Switzerland is a small homogenous country. Is America so large that our contentious supermajority-based system is simply ungovernable under any system? So it's a great question because actually Switzerland is rather diverse, and so are many other small countries. And the thing about very small countries that have very high foreign-born populations, in fact, in a country like Switzerland or other European countries or Singapore or elsewhere, they have a higher foreign-born percentage of the population than even we do. So they're not homogenous the way you're suggesting, but they are small. Now, we used to think that big countries can never learn from small countries. We're just way more complex. Our challenges are much larger and so forth. But if you think of America, instead of just being 100 times larger than some little European country, and instead think of it in terms of these 40 key urban nodes and all of the areas that surround them and depend on them economically, think of us as 40 Switzerlands. At least that's what we should try to become, right? And then you can break the problem down into these manageable sorts of chunks. And that, again, requires a better balance between the power of the federal government and the devolutionary authorities that cities and city regions and states have. And we haven't gotten that balance right because we don't allocate our spending sort of wisely, and we don't do our decision-making in that way, but I think we should. And that would be one of the ways in which a big country like America can learn from smaller countries, to think of itself as a collection of these sort of city-states.
Hi, I do have a question. I mean, I've been trying to analyze this myself, and honestly, I think I don't have all the information to do so. So I'm a NAFTA worker. And I do have, the urgent, let's say, burning thought of how possible it is for America to actually leave NAFTA. Like, if that's even possible. taking into account that it's a complex scenario where economies are intertwined. It's not the same thing as, abandoning just the short-term relationship. This has been going on for 10 or 20 years. So
great question. I think there are many ways to answer it. I'll just try to be quick. I mean, is it politically possible? Yes, you can declare you plan to exit such a thing. Is it legally possible? That's more complicated because there's countermeasures and retaliation and specific legal steps you have to take to sort of withdraw from a treaty. And I think your question most importantly is it smart? And the answer is no, it's not very smart to exit NAFTA. Again, now that this crisis has been created, economists are diving deeper in the data to defend NAFTA, and I wish that this data were more available during the campaign, or in general all the time, so that people were more educated. But we don't have a big trade deficit with Mexico, and if you actually look at the value added share of Mexico, a lot of what Mexico exports to us, or when we think about, like, say, automobile components that are made in Mexico and exported back to us, a lot of the components are made here or designed here. So the value added share of Mexico's exports to us includes a lot of stuff from us. And it requires a bit deeper analysis to understand that, but it simply means that if you were to just raise tariffs on Mexican exports to the US, you would actually wind up hurting a lot of American jobs. So there is this sort of reciprocity and feedback loops in these things that honestly aren't that hard to understand if people would just take the time to either map them out clearly and get educated on the issues. Then politicians wouldn't be able to lie about them so easily. We actually don't have any time left. The clock just hit 0, and I know there's other sessions. So happy to stick around and talk to anyone. Thank you so much.